So I'm Andrew Drybrough. I'm an academic English instructor here at, actually in this block, the Graduate School of Education. And my talk is going to be pivoting an EAP PhD course from in-person to online and back again. So I'm reflecting back on a course I taught in a different higher education institution in the UK. And I actually teach a very similar one here, but in person. So let's have a look at the context. So I'm going to use Gibbs reflective cycle to reflect on the course I taught back in the UK, which is a PhD EAP writing board course. And that was pivoted during COVID from an in-person course to an online course during the emergency teaching period. And then I actually teach quite a similar one over here, which is a PhD EAP writing support course. But it's in person, and hopefully it will remain in person as part of the reflection. So I'm going to use Gibbs reflective cycle, which has the 6 different stages, description of the experience, my feelings and thoughts about what happened, and an evaluation and analysis, and then some conclusion and action plan. So that's the kind of framework I'm going to use to reflect on what happened. Okay, so I'm going to kind of integrate that framework into the structure of the presentation. So the aim first to critically reflect on that particular course that I taught and was the director of in the UK during that COVID period, to evaluate what I learned from it, and then what could we do or should we do in the future if this were to happen again, if we either in an emergency situation or in a different context where maybe we might be asked to create an online course. Okay, so the first one, I'm going to reflect back. I'll give you a little bit of context of what happened. So back in, I think it was about, they had 3 semesters at this point. You had a kind of fall or autumn semester and then a spring semester doing this course. And then during that spring semester around March 2020, there was a third iteration of this course for what was kind of summer 2020. And we were asked to change that spring course that we were repeating for the 3rd time into an online course. It's in English for specific academic purposes. So we had, it's not got the numbers yet, the numbers over here, there were 3 classes, and 1 class was for social sciences. So this was an EAP department for the whole of the university. And we had, we decided to split the classes into social sciences, humanities, and science PhD students. And they were preparing for what was called the first year board. I'm sure it's on here. Yeah, over here. At the end of the PhD, at the end of the first year, they had to present an introduction, a literature review, and the methods. And they had to pass that in order to progress for their PhD after that. So we were preparing them for that purpose. And often the nature of the course would involve an introduction and something on literature review, something on objectives and methods and research design. So that was a kind of, it was very much a genre-based or sub-genre-based design course, and we'd help them in their writing. It was non-credit. That means students attended this on a voluntary basis. It wasn't mandatory, but there were limited places. So sometimes students were referred by their supervisors saying, this person needs more help in the academic writing. Please, so help them. So, as I said, it was in a university-wide English language support centre. I was both an instructor and the course director for this course at the time. So that's the context, and if you have any questions on that later, you can ask me. Just one more thing, the hours. They were originally 7 classes of 3 hours, but we reduced it to 2 hours for the pivoted course per week. Okay, so the lesson procedure involved students were given a pre-reading on the materials, and then before the class they could also put things on the discussion board, and then there was a short writing task in class. They would do short writing tasks, and then they were given a longer writing task as their homework. And during the week, I would then give them feedback, usually by email. And then I would also give class feedback at the beginning of each class about the general things that they had to work on as well. And then we go back to the short writing tasks in each class. And there were a little bit of discussion as well, and writing. So the little writing tasks would help build up to the homework tasks. So it was kind of preparation. And they would get feedback, I think, at least in the in-person class, and have feedback within class for these little writing tasks. With the online ones, I think they would post it, and I can give them maybe verbal feedback, but there wasn't much chance of giving feedback during the class for the online versions. I think that was quite a difficult thing to do. Okay, so that was the kind of structure. It was on the Learn Collaborate platform. So the Collaborate was the kind of live, the synchronous session. Learn was the asynchronous. Okay, so how did it go? Well, this is an example of emergency remote learning, which is different from just online learning, because it was an emergency period. We had to pivot these courses very quickly. I mean, I felt it was doable because I'd actually had an input in the design of the original materials. So I thought, okay, I can kind of pivot these a little bit. I think it actually fitted quite well with a UK PhD, because the UK PhD is the students are a lot more autonomous, and they don't actually have to do classes. Okay, so it's a lot more autonomous. It's the supervisor, PhD student, they work together, and the supervisor gives the PhD student targets every month, and they work on those. So there's a lot more autonomy than, say, the American style PhD, which is more like how it's set up here. I was up for the challenge, because I was the originator of a lot of these materials. I'd already tweaked them in the past. So I thought, okay, what would work in a pivoted online version of the course? So I was quite positive about it at the beginning. Right, what my evaluation? So I think the first thing, obviously there were challenges for the online platform. I'd say it was quite creaky in terms of it was Collaborate, which I don't know if anyone's used that in the past. Collaborate, I wouldn't recommend it. I think there were bandwidth issues, so connection issues. I know it's in the UK, it's developed, but just we couldn't use the video, because as soon as you started using video, things just started breaking down. So we had to switch all the videos off. And at that time, I think we had to stop the video, so it was just sound. I think engagement is an issue that's come up, I think, in the plenary about how do you engage students. I think that's a big issue with online courses. So those who are really committed to the cause would stuck to the end, and we had 5 out of 12 who stayed to the end, because the end was a special kind of, the last lesson was very special, and it was a one-to-one, and that was where I think that's what worked really well. So remember, it's not compulsory, it's not a mandatory course, so they didn't have to do it, but I think that worked well. So the final class, I think, was the one that was most rewarding. So where I got together all the feedback I'd given to the students, and we just go through a session. What did they learn? How could they move forward? And how could they progress? I mean, I think there was one student, I think she was actually it was one of the Central Asian countries, I think it was Turkmenistan, who had sent me her whole first year board, which was really impressive, actually. I actually had the time to read through it, because a lot of them had disengaged. I had a lot more time for those 5. I read through the whole introduction literature review methodology. I was really impressed, and just tweaked things and gave a lot of suggestions. So if students engaged, they got the response from the tutor. And I think she successfully probably would have passed that first year board, no problem. So I think that's a really important thing with online courses, how much the students basically up for the how much the students are willing to actually put into it. That's the benefit, depending on how much they put into it. Okay, it's relatively low stakes in terms of that it was voluntary. It was kind of selective, self-selective. Students who wanted to do this course did this course. So there wasn't that much pressure. So hence there's probably a certain amount of dropout rate from that as well. But I think going back to the issues with the bandwidth, this is relatively new at the time. Students weren't engaging as much necessarily, but those who did, I think, benefited a lot. Okay, so the analysis here. So the first thing is, I think the VLE, the virtual learning educational platform, so it's Learn, Collaborate. It's not the newest, and I think the main problem was Collaborate. I think we did eventually, so I'll go back, we did actually move on to Teams a few months later. The institution realized Collaborate was just not good enough. So they purchased Teams, the license for Teams, Microsoft Teams, and it definitely improved, because I was actually involved in the pre-sessional master's online pivoted course as well later on that year, and Teams was the platform that they used after that. I think looking back, I wasn't the only tutor, but this is something that we do find is teacher training. Teachers have to be trained how to use the technology, obviously, and I'm not saying that this was necessarily the case from my experience in terms of the reluctance, but looking at previous literature, especially when you have an emergency situation, teachers don't always, either they're not trained enough or they're not willing to engage in all the technology that's available. So that is an issue, a general issue, not necessarily from this course. Obviously, there's issues of student connectivity, the digital divide. Some students have better connectivity than others. They're able to engage more with others. I think that's still an issue here, because I know of other instructors who do this kind of course here, and there's students in some other town or city. Either they have problems with connectivity, or they say they have problems with connectivity as an excuse. We don't really know. So I work with another tutor who does online courses that are mandatory, and she has to adapt those courses. For example, if attendance is part of your grading and somebody can't attend because they have connectivity issues, then what do you do? So that's still an issue. It was an issue then in the UK. It might be that they're working from home and they haven't got decent Wi-Fi at home. What can you do? You can't really give it to them. Or if they're working from home here. So I think that's still an issue, and some people can pay for more, some people can't. I had the same question. I remember in the UK, I was doing crazy things. I realized my internet connectivity was not good enough, so I got a new provider to install a higher spec. It took 2 weeks where I had no internet connectivity. I was literally going to outside. Luckily, it was summer. I had my laptop. I had meetings outside the library, which had Wi-Fi. The library was closed. The university was like, I was getting my Wi-Fi and having meetings out in the sun. Luckily, it was warm. So it was really, and then then the laptop would gradually run out of power. I then switched to my phone. It's ridiculous. And so this is still an issue, but in a different different context, obviously. Student engagement, motivation, I've already mentioned that. How do you keep students engaged? And that's a kind of open question. And I think maybe there are other sessions that will look at that over here. And how do you keep them engaged in the synchronous and the asynchronous sessions as well? Because I also teach online master's courses here. So that's always a question that we think about. Okay, looking forward, looking at the Kazakh context. So the context here is actually in person. It's in the class I teach. The hours are longer. I'd say it's English for very specific academic purposes. So it's a graduate school of education. In some ways, it's quite similar in terms of the structure. We have an overview, go through introductions, literature review, methodology. It's an academic writing preparation course for their proposal defense, which is the equivalent here of the first year board. It's mandatory, so it's a credit based and it's mandatory, but it's based on the pass-fail system. It's not based on a grade. So students have to attend this one. It's over here. I'm an academic instructor and I'm also the course designer of this one. So there's actually quite similarities between this one and the previous one, but it's in person and the hours are longer as well. Okay, so I think my conclusion, could this type of course, the question I was going to ask, could this type of course be pivoted in the future? It could be in theory, but obviously we have to think about issues like virtual learning environment. What system, what platform are we going to use? I do actually teach a course like that, and we're using Moodle, for example. and now Teams, or it was Zoom, but because I had experience using Teams in this other one, then I'm actually very familiar with Teams. I'm very comfortable with it, and I have a way of operating it because I taught it in the UK institution. So, you know, how are you going to operate the asynchronous? I think mainly through Moodle, I think, for example, and how you're going to operate the synchronous, which is mainly through Teams. Obviously, there's issues of connectivity and flexibility. We have to, with the master's course I teach, we have 2 sessions, one in the evening and one in the daytime. So I get a survey of the students and find out when it's most convenient. So that might be the same thing with a PhD. It might be you have to find out the best time if it were to be pivoted. Again, we've still got issues of engagement and monitoring. I think if students, if they have this, I can't connect, I've got a problem, how do we monitor the engagement? I think we've also got issues of high and low stakes. I think that's the EAP tends to be lower stakes than the content courses, but they still have to complete them. So I think it's, and that's connected to engagement. I think if it's low stakes, maybe they don't engage as much. And then obviously getting feedback from students, what's worked. So what's happened, I've noticed my in-person classes get better ratings in terms of the evaluations than my online. So this is part of my justification for I said I think in-person is better. It's a personal opinion, but I noticed that the evaluations tend to be better, the in-person than the online. So I think so. The final section, the action plan, should of course be pivoted in the future. That's an open question. I guess the answer is it depends. But you have to decide what works best for a particular course, in person or online. I say I teach both types. Asynchronous and synchronous tasks, what can be done at home, what should be done when you meet online. I think obviously there's great opportunities with online courses. There's the flexibility of location. It depends on the course type. There's an element of student autonomy. But I think there are challenges. And as I mentioned before, those challenges of engagement, challenges of technology, and that kind of digital divide as well. I mean, I can give one example of, we do also teach classes here. I think I was teaching last week where the students actually come and we see them in person. So I teach them online as well. And the other week, my students, who I most of them I recognized, and then, but there was one student, and I thought she was really engaged in class, and I thought, I don't know who that student is. I can't remember, I don't recognize her from the pictures. And as a great student, but I can't remember if I actually taught her in my class. I don't know if she's a student that was coming back, or if she was a student that was actually in my class, but didn't engage online. So that's an example of where I think the in-person is really important. You suddenly see the personality of the students a lot more. So my argument is in-person is, in my opinion, a lot better if we can keep that as much as possible. I think that's it. Right.